The Varath Meridian had been in service for 14 years and had the specific, accumulated character of a working vessel that had been maintained correctly and used hard, and was the result of both. Davan Rourke had been its primary cargo pilot for 6 of those 14 years, which had given him the specific, practical familiarity with the ship that pilots developed when the ship was their daily environment. Not affection, exactly. Though affection was present in the way it was present in any long-term working relationship, but the deeper thing, the thing where you knew something so well that the knowing was in your hands, and your assessment reflex before it was in your conscious mind. He knew the Meridian was lost about 12 minutes into the raid, which was 3 minutes before the official assessment reached the same conclusion, and spent those 3 minutes doing the things that were available to do, which were not many and were not sufficient, which he also knew, but which were what was available and therefore what he did. The holding cell in the pirate installation was smaller than his quarters on the Meridian and had less ventilation and considerably less of everything else. He had been in it for approximately 20 minutes when he became aware that the cell adjacent to his was occupied. She was sitting in the corner that had the best sight line to the cell block's entry point, which was not the corner with the best comfort characteristics, but was the correct corner for someone who had assessed the situation and prioritized operationally relevant positioning over comfort. He noted this. "How long have you been here?" he said through the partition. The partition had a gap at approximately shoulder height, not deliberate, a fixture fault, the kind of gap that appeared in installations that had been built for function rather than engineered for it. 3 hours before you, she said. Her voice had the quality of someone who was being careful and had decided that a basic exchange of situation data was within the range of careful. Which ship? Not the Meridian, she said. I know, he said. I watched the Meridian go down. I'm asking which one you were on. A pause of the specific quality of a pause that preceded a decision about how much to say. The Keth Passage, she said. Passenger transit. Your crew. Another pause. I was aboard, she said, which was accurate and was not the same thing as crew and was, he understood, the level of information she had decided to offer. Davan Rourke, he said. Primary pilot Meridian. 6 years on this corridor. Sail, she said. One name. He filed this as appropriately cautious in a captive situation, not a flag. Standard procedure when you didn't know the captor's information interests was to minimize disclosure until you understood the landscape better. He would have done the same. The rations arrived at what was apparently the installation standard interval, a single container per cell, the contents adequate in the way of things that were calculated to maintain biological function without providing surplus. He looked at his portion, he looked at the partition. Split it, he said, a pause. You don't need to. You've been here 3 hours longer than me, he said. Your last meal was earlier than mine. Split it. A longer pause, then all right. He passed half through the partition gap. She took it with the directness of someone who had assessed the offer and found it practical and was accepting the practical thing without performing gratitude that would use energy both of them needed for other things. He noted this also. What do you know about the installation's layout? He said. I can see the cell block entry from my corner, she said. Guard rotation is approximately 40 minutes. 2 guards, they switch at the rotation, but there's a 90-second gap in the overlap where only one is present at the entry point. He sat with this. You've been tracking the rotation for 3 hours. 2.5, she said. The first 30 minutes I was determining whether the rotation was consistent or variable. Is it consistent? Consistent within a 3-minute variance, she said, which suggests a schedule rather than judgment-based timing. Scheduled rather than responsive, he said. That's useful. Yes, she said, I thought so. He looked at the cell's physical characteristics, the door mechanism, the fixture fault in the partition, the ventilation access that was too small for egress but might be relevant for other purposes, the material composition of the floor which was the standard installation composite, and had the specific, known characteristics of standard installation, composite that a person who had spent time in operational environments had filed in the category of things you knew in case they were relevant. Tell me more about the entry point, he said. By day 4 they had a plan. By day 6 they had 3 plans, because the first plan had a dependency on a timing assumption that day 5's observation had not confirmed, and the second plan had a material problem that Davan had identified on day 4, and that Sale had been sitting with, and had resolved in a way he hadn't anticipated, but that was, when she explained the reasoning, clearly correct. The third one, he said, on day 6, in the specific voice of someone reviewing something they had been working on and had arrived at the version they were going to commit to. South Corridor guard gap, the ventilation shaft for the secondary access rather than the main egress. The ventilation shaft access requires a tool we don't currently have, she said. I have the fixture bracket from the water vessel mount, he said. I've been working on the bracket since day 2. The geometry is close enough. She was quiet for a moment. He had come to understand that her quiet was not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet of assessment. She went silent when she was running the logic, and she ran the logic before she responded, which was the opposite of the way most people he had worked with operated, and which he found specifically useful. Show me the bracket, she said. He passed it through the partition gap, a silence while she assessed it. Then, the tensile strength is going to be the variable. If the shaft housing is the standard installation grade, this will work. If it's reinforced, the installation is built for function rather than engineered, he said. The fix on the partition gap is a standard installation composite patch. The fixture fault on my water vessel mount was the same composite. They're not using reinforced grade. Another silence, then all right, the third plan. The South Corridor egress timing, he said. The 40-minute guard rotation, we move in the gap. We have 90 seconds at the entry point. We need to be in the corridor before the second guard returns. The gap is 90 seconds, she said. The corridor transit to the ventilation shaft access is 70 meters. At a compromised movement rate, your left knee has been showing stress indicators since day 2. My left knee is fine, he said. Your left knee shows a gait compensation pattern that indicates soft tissue stress, she said, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than expressing concern. At compensated movement rate, 70 meters is approximately 45 seconds. That leaves 45 seconds for the shaft access, which requires the bracket manipulation. 45 seconds is sufficient if the manipulation goes correctly, he said, and if it doesn't, then we have a different problem, he said. I'd like to plan for the different problem, she said. Planning for the different problem uses planning resources that might be better applied to not having the different problem, he said. Planning for the different problem is how you don't have the different problem, she said, in the specific, dry tone she deployed when she was certain she was right and was waiting for him to arrive at the same certainty. He thought about it. He thought about the bracket and the shaft housing and the 45 seconds and the gait compensation that she had apparently been assessing since day 2 with the specific attention of someone who tracked operationally relevant information, because accurate records did not require optimal conditions. What's the contingency? He said. If the bracket fails, she said, we abort to the primary egress rather than the secondary. The risk profile is higher, but the timing problem doesn't apply because the primary egress doesn't require the shaft access. The primary egress puts us in the open corridor for longer, he said. Yes, she said, which is why it's the contingency rather than the plan. He sat with the logic. The logic was sound. He was not going to tell her this immediately because the debate was operationally useful, and because she was right often enough that conceding too quickly would establish a dynamic that was less useful than the productive friction of two people who were both thinking about the same problem. The timing on the contingency, he said. If we abort to primary egress, We lose the gap window and we're in the open when the second guard returns. Yes, she said. Which means the contingency requires a different approach to the second guard's return. I've been thinking about that. Tell me, he said. She told him. He thought about it for a while and told her the problem with the part that had a problem, and she thought about it for a while and told him how the problem was addressed, and he thought about the address and found it was correct, and they had a plan and a contingency. It's good, he said. Yes, she said, it is. He divided the day's ration through the partition, and she divided hers back and they ate the combined portion, in the proportions that the combined portion split into 2 people required, which was equal, and which was how they had done it since day 1, and which would later be characterized by one of them as equitable and by the other as a matter of hydration documentation. Day 9 had a water distribution disagreement that he stood by. The water vessel was positioned on his side of the partition gap by virtue of the cell geometry, not by choice. The cells had been configured before they were in them, and the vessel's placement was a function of where the supply access was, which was on his side. This had not been a problem on days 1 through 8, because the vessel was kept accessible to both sides through the gap, and the access was managed by informal agreement. On day 9, the informal agreement encountered the specific, practical problem that the vessel's position on his side of the gap meant his reach was more efficient than hers, which meant the informal agreement required him to actively counteract the efficiency of his reach in order to maintain equal access, which was a reasonable requirement and one he had been maintaining. On day 9, he had a headache. The headache was the product of the ventilation quality in the cell, which had been consistently insufficient, and which had been accumulating in the specific, biological way of insufficient ventilation over 9 days. He had been managing the headache since the morning rotation. The managing had used cognitive resources that would otherwise have been applied to other things, including the equitable water distribution management. You are accessing the vessel more frequently than the distribution protocol requires, she said. I have a headache, he said. The headache does not change the distribution protocol, she said. The distribution protocol is an informal agreement, he said, not a binding contract. An informal agreement is a contract, she said, in the relevant sense. Stop hogging the water, he said. He said it in the specific, exasperated tone of someone who had a headache, and was aware that the argument they were making was not their strongest argument, and was making it anyway because the headache had reduced the availability of the stronger arguments. There was a silence. Then, from the other side of the partition, the specific, involuntary quality of something that was not quite a laugh and was not quite not one, the contained version, the version he had heard before at the moments when something had landed correctly in whatever place things landed correctly for her, and which he had been filing alongside everything else he had been filing since day 1. That is not an accurate characterization of the distribution, she said, when the contained version had completed itself. It is from where I'm sitting, he said. You are sitting on the side with the vessel, she said. Yes, he said. And yet. Another silence. Then, I will adjust the access protocol to account for the efficiency differential, she said, which was the way she conceded things, which was not the way most people conceded things, and which was the way she conceded things, and which he had come to find specifically, characteristically hers. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said, in the tone that was the other kind of dry, the kind that was not the waiting for you to arrive at the same certainty dry, but the kind that was adjacent to the contained laugh, and which was, he had understood somewhere in the middle of the 9 days, the version of her that existed when she had stopped managing the exterior. He thought about this sometimes, not the version that managed the exterior, the version underneath. He thought about it and filed it and did not examine what he was filing it for. The rescue came on day 17, which was not when the ransom negotiation timeline suggested it would come, and was not from the direction that coalition security response would have come from. He was running the day's variation of the South Corridor egress plan. They had been refining it since day 6, the bracket improving with the incremental work he had been doing on it, the contingency developing additional depth as the observation data on the guard rotation produced more accurate timing. When the installation shook, not the vibration of mechanical failure, the vibration of something external with significant mass, producing a significant effect on the installation's structural environment. He knew this vibration in the way of someone who had been on vessels that had been hit and had survived the hitting and had developed, through the survival, a specific literacy for the quality of shaking and what it indicated. "That's weapons fire," he said. "Yes," she said. "Large caliber ordnance, multiple sources." Coalition security response doesn't use large caliber ordnance on a hostage installation, he said. "No," she said, in the voice of someone who was very still and very focused and was waiting. "Who does?" he said. She did not answer. The installation sounds changed across the next 40 minutes in the specific, layered way of a facility moving from operational to compromised to controlled. The alarms, the power fluctuation, the guard rotation that did not happen because the guards had different priorities, the distant sounds of the kind of efficiency that came from a force that knew exactly what it was doing and had been preparing to do it. The breach of the cell block was 4 hours after the first shaking, which was when the operational sequencing reached the cell block, which meant the operational sequencing had been very thorough about everything before the cell block, which was consistent with a force that had entered with overwhelming capability and had processed the installation completely before confirming the objective's location. The extraction team came through the block entry in the specific, focused quality of people who had been doing this for 4 hours and had one task remaining. The team lead was a senior officer. Cale could read the grade in the bearing and the way the team organized around him, and he was moving with the efficiency of completion rather than urgency when he reached the cells. He looked at the cell adjacent to Davan's. He stopped. Not the operational stop of someone assessing a situation. The stop of a person whose processing had encountered something that required a different kind of response than the operation had been running on. The officer behind him ran the same stop. Everyone in the corridor ran the same stop. He watched it happen. He watched the team lead come to the specific. Absolute attention that was not the attention of a soldier completing a task, but the attention of someone who had arrived in the presence of something that the task had been in service of, but was larger than the task. And he watched the team lead's expression do the specific, complex thing that expressions did when they were receiving something they had been waiting for without knowing if the waiting was going to resolve. "That," said the team lead in a voice that was using formal language because formal language was all that was available, "is the extraction confirmed." And then, to the cell door, "Divine Executor, we are here." He heard her exhale. One breath, controlled. The specific breath of someone who had been managing something for 17 days and was putting the management down. The fleet admiral arrived in the installation's former command section 12 minutes after the extraction, which was 12 minutes of Davan standing in the corridor, while the apparatus of a fleet operation reorganized around the fact of her, and 12 minutes of her managing the apparatus with the specific, efficient quality he had been watching for 17 days, and was watching in a different context. The admiral was a tall man with the bearing of someone who had been commanding significant forces for a long time, and who was, at this moment, doing something his bearing was not designed for, which was managing a level of relief that was beyond the operational register, and was showing at the edges in the specific, involuntary way of things that had been under control for too long. "Divine Executor," the admiral said. "The sector-wide mobilization has been active since the Keth Passage failed to report. 3 active war zones have been contributing fleet assets to the search operation. 17 days. "I am aware of the timeline, Admiral," she said. The pilot, the admiral, looked at Davan in the specific way that a senior fleet officer looked at someone who did not have a category in the current operational framework. The cargo pilot who was taken with you. We have documentation that he was in the adjacent cell. Yes, she said, for the full 17 days. Yes, she said. The Admiral looked at Davan with the expression of someone doing an assessment that was producing results he was not certain what to do with. He was unaware, the Admiral said. It was not a question. He was, she said. The Admiral looked at the Admiral's own expression, which was the expression of a man deciding which register to use for the next sentence, and selecting the formal one because it was the most reliable. Mr. Rourke, he said, you spent 17 days in adjacent captivity with the Divine Executor, Supreme Military Commander of the Zenith Protectorate. Her disappearance triggered a mobilization that. Admiral, she said. The Admiral stopped. She looked at Davan. He looked at her. She was the same person who had tracked the guard rotation for 2.5 hours before deciding it was consistent. She was the same person who had told him the bracket geometry was going to determine the timing variable. She was the same person who had, on day 12, said the timing on the South Corridor egress has a problem in the specific, precise tone of someone who was right and was telling him, and had been right. She was the same person from the other side of the partition who had said accurate records do not require optimal conditions when he had asked how she had kept hydration documentation in a cell. She was also apparently the Supreme Military Commander of the Zenith Protectorate, and her disappearance had pulled fleets from 3 active war zones. Both of these things were her. He treated me, she said, as someone who was in the same situation he was in. She looked at the Admiral. Complete the extraction protocols. I'll debrief in the primary staging area. She looked at Davan. I'd like to speak with you after the immediate protocols. I have a cargo route, he said. It was what arrived because it was true and because the cognitive apparatus was still processing the scope of the revision and had defaulted to what was simply accurate. I know, she said. I've reviewed your employment file. Of course she had. It can be delayed, she said, in the specific tone he had heard once before, which was the tone that was asking rather than the tone that was the other kind. He looked at her. He looked at the Admiral, who was managing the experience of watching this exchange with the specific, studied neutrality of a senior officer who had decided the most correct posture was the professional one. After the protocols, he said. After the protocols, she said. The secondary briefing room was quiet in the specific way of rooms that had been part of something significant and were now in the aftermath. The operational apparatus had moved to the primary staging area. The room had a table and 2 chairs, and the specific, stripped quality of a space that had been cleared of everything that wasn't the 2 people in it. She sat across from him. He sat across from her. He had not been across a table from her for 17 days. The partition had organized their spatial relationship through the gap, which was a different geometry than a table. And the across-a-table quality was both familiar in the specific way of someone he knew and new in the specific way of a context he hadn't seen her in. Tell me about the water on day 9, she said. He looked at her. This was not where he had expected the conversation to begin. I had a headache, he said. You accessed the vessel 6 times between the morning rotation and the midday ration, she said. The equitable distribution protocol, established through informal agreement, provided for 3 times per equivalent period. I had a headache, he said. Yes, she said, you mentioned that. She looked at him with the expression that was not managing anything. In 11 years of commanding the Zenith Protectorate's military forces, no one has told me I was hogging anything. He looked at the table. The water distribution was not equitable, he said. The vessel was on my side of the gap. The efficiency differential was in my favor, and I was not fully counteracting the efficiency differential. The 6 accesses were 2 above protocol. Yes, she said. You were also right about the egress timing on day 12, he said. I was. The bracket contingency was your solution, he said. The primary egress risk profile assessment was yours. The guard rotation tracking was yours from the first 2.5 hours. Yes, she said. I was right about the partition gap, he said, and the composite grade, and the approach to the ration division. You were, she said. We were right about different things, he said, and wrong about different things. Yes, she said. That is an accurate summary of the 17 days. He thought about the 17 days in the specific, methodical way he thought about significant information, organizing it in the order that produced clarity, which was the honest order rather than the comfortable one. He thought about the guard rotation and the bracket geometry, and the hydration documentation, and the south corridor egress, and the contingency, and the day 12 timing problem that she had been right about. He thought about what it was to have been in a cell for 17 days with someone who had been right about the things she was right about and wrong about the things she was wrong about, and who had not at any point been anything other than the person doing the thinking. You knew the whole time, he said. Yes, she said. You could have said. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She was quiet for a moment with the quiet that was assessment rather than avoidance. The first day, she said. I did not say because I was assessing the situation. By day 3, I was not saying because the situation had produced something I did not have a category for, and I was trying to understand the category. She looked at him. You argued with my egress plan. It had a timing problem, he said. Yes, she said. And you told me so. You told me so in the specific way of someone who had assessed the plan and found a problem and was telling me the problem because the problem was there, not because of any other reason. But it was there, he said. I know, she said. That is the category I did not have. She looked at the table. I have been in command for 11 years. In 11 years, people have agreed with my plans because I am who I am, or they have disagreed with my plans because they disagreed with me specifically as a political or operational matter. No one has told me. The plan had a timing problem because the timing problem was there. He sat with this. The day 12 assessment, he said. You sat with it for 4 hours before you conceded, she said. Not because you were performing resistance, because you were actually thinking about whether I was right. You were right, he said. I know, she said. You told me when you had determined that, not before, not reflexively. She looked at him. In 11 years, Davan, no one has waited until they had determined it. He looked at her. I did not say anything, she said, because you were treating me as someone who was in the same situation you were in. As someone whose thinking was the thinking and whose plans were the plans, and whose assessment of the water distribution was either right or wrong on the merits. She paused. I have not been treated that way in 11 years. I did not want to end it. He thought about the same thing he had been thinking for 17 days, and was thinking about differently now. Which was the quality of her thinking, and what it was like to be in the presence of the better tactical mind, and to find that the better tactical mind was interested in the argument, because the argument produced better solutions, and what it was like when the argument produced better solutions, and what it was like to know that the better solutions were the point. You said you wanted to speak with me about what the captivity produced, he said, and what you want to do with it. Yes, she said. What do you want to do with it, he said. She looked at him with the full, direct attention that was her register for the significant things. I want to continue, she said. I do not know the practical form the continuation takes. I am not, she stopped. She started again in the way of someone who was choosing the accurate words rather than the managed ones. I am the Divine Executor. I command the Zenith Protectorate's military forces. I have 3 active war zones and a sector-wide mobilization to stand down and 17 days of operational gap to reconstruct. She looked at him. I am also the person who tracked the guard rotation for 2.5 hours on the first day, because accurate information was better than comfortable assumptions. Those are the same person. I know, he said. The practical form, she said. I don't have it. I have the intention and not the form. He thought about the bracket and the geometry, and the timing problem on the South Corridor egress. He thought about the way good plans were developed, which was not by having the complete plan before you started, but by having the right starting point and reading the route as you went. The South Corridor egress, he said. She looked at him. Day 6, he said. We had the plan, and we had the contingency, and we had the analysis of the timing problem, and we had the bracket, and we had 17 days of observation data on the guard rotation. He looked at her. We didn't have a guarantee. No, she said. We had a good assessment and accurate information and the willingness to abort to contingency if the primary failed, he said. That was what we had. She was quiet for a moment. That is the practical form, she said. It's the form I know how to work with, he said. So do I, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The briefing room held them both in the specific, quiet quality of a space that had been part of something significant, and was now in the beginning of the next thing, which was not the same as the something significant, but was connected to it in the way that beginnings were connected to what had made them possible. The water on day 9, he said, was not equitably distributed, she said. I had a headache, he said. You have said, she said. I'm saying again, he said, for the record. I keep records, she said. I know, he said. You kept hydration documentation in a cell. Accurate records do not require optimal conditions, she said. He looked at her. The dry quality, the version that was adjacent to the contained laugh, the version from the other side of the partition. No, he said, they don't. Outside the secondary briefing room, the fleet extraction apparatus was doing its extraction apparatus work, standing down the mobilization, reconstructing the operational gap, managing the specific, enormous machinery of 17 days of military response returning to its regular posture. 3 active war zones were receiving their assets back. The Verath Meridian's cargo company was receiving a delay accommodation notice. The sector was receiving confirmation that the Divine Executor was alive and functional, and had been in the adjacent cell to a cargo pilot from the Keth corridor for 17 days, which was information that the sector was going to have significant feelings about. He had a cargo route. She had 3 war zones. Both of these things were